Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On today's show, we speak with Paul Griffiths, the CEO of Dubai Airports, to ask whether the airport is ready for an IPO, if sky-high fuel prices will change travellers' summer plans, and how regional competitors and changes in partner plans are affecting his business. Paul, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Now, you certainly had a very solid start to the year at Dubai Airports. More than 13.6 million people passing through Dubai International Airport for the first quarter of this year. Now, that's been your busiest quarter in a couple of years. In fact, you say you expect to return to pre-pandemic growth at the start of 2024. Now, that's important because it's a year ahead of schedule. So I guess the big question is now the time to issue an IPO?
Very good question, actually, but not a question that is within my remit, because obviously the government of Dubai owns Dubai Airports. We've obviously performed extremely well, even during the pandemic. And should they decide that we are worthy of an IPO, of course, that would be something that we would relish, but it's their decision.
I mean, we've certainly seen a big increase in IPOs in the region over the last couple of years. Saudi and UAE raising $20 billion since the start of 2020. We've seen earlier this year some big results from DEWA, the world's second largest IPO. You would have to admit, in this kind of climate, Dubai Airports would certainly be a very good IPO if it was issued.
Well, I think it's a sign of maturity of many cities around the region that we're now getting to a stage where we've got a great track record of strong growth, good performance, good financial controls, and a sound strategy. And those are all good components for an IPO. But as I said earlier, that is not a decision that's within the airport management team's remit. So we'll wait and see. I'm optimistic that at some stage in the near future, there may be such a decision.
I'm sure you're privy to a lot of behind-the-scenes discussions, though. What would be some of the prerequisites for Dubai Airports to issue? Would Emirates have to go first? I know Sir Tim Clark recently told media he had to turn his phone off because he was getting so many calls from bankers around the world wanting to get a piece of the pie from Emirates if they do issue. His Highness Sheikh Ahmed has been discussing it recently. What would be some of the prerequisites for Dubai Airports, for the government to be deciding that?
Well, I think the thing is the aerospace sector in Dubai has always been a pillar of the economy. 34% of the total economy of Dubai is geared around travel and tourism. We're an incredibly important asset to the Dubai government. And actually, airports around the world do actually record pretty high profits to earning ratio valuations. So I think the airport would be an attractive candidate for IPO. And I think our figures and our track record, even through the pandemic, would support such a move. But as I say, it's obviously not our decision.
Well, the government has sent 10 big entities this year, so I guess watch this space.
Indeed.
Now, looking at Dubai Airports, Emirates makes up around 60-70% of all the passenger traffic that goes through. How concerned are you about some of the issues they're facing? We're seeing continued lockdowns in China, ongoing delays from the Boeing 777s. We're seeing these very high fuel prices. Now they're increasing ticket prices for the consumers. Do you think any of these issues could potentially dent the expectations for summer travel at Dubai Airports?
I think through the pandemic, Dubai has done a pretty good job to reassure the travelling public that it's a great city to visit. Our tourism and hospitality infrastructure is some of the best in the world. And we've seen actually the demand for Dubai absolutely skyrocket. We actually were 111% ahead of our pre-pandemic visitor arrival traffic over the end of last year. And actually, at the moment, we're about 100%. So those are pretty strong figures. The weakness in some of the transfer markets, particularly in Asia, notably China, obviously is of concern. But we're roughly 50% recovered in the transfer markets, and I foresee that that's going to improve over the next few months. High fuel prices, obviously a concern, but at the moment we're in a little bit of a bubble because, of course, the supply side of airlines has yet to recover fully. A lot of airlines around the world have grounded fleets of aircraft, some of which they're not planning to return to service. However, Emirates' position is pretty strong at the moment. They are taking advantage, I think, of some of the strong recovery in a lot of markets, particularly in the West. And I don't think actually we've got anything to concern us about recovery over the next few months. Few economic signs, perhaps inflation globally, and by the end of the year, maybe things will be different. But for the moment, actually, the recovery in travel is extremely strong, and I can't see any signs of it weakening in the near future.
Okay, so it's obviously positive news for Dubai. No slowdown that you're forecasting for summer travel, which is good news for the economy here, alongside the oil prices, which I think our local economies are enjoying some benefits from. There's certainly some big changes underway at DXB at the moment. You've got your northern runway that's currently closed for refurbishment. Are you on track to reopen on June the 22nd? Could it be even earlier?
It's unlikely to be earlier, but we are definitely going to open on June 22nd as scheduled. Works are going very well. Some of the replacement of the major assets has already been completed slightly ahead of schedule. I'm absolutely confident we will open on schedule. We've done this twice before, and each time the program's gone flawlessly. So I think we'll be in good shape.
Will we as consumers be able to notice some of the changes? Will there be anything that changes the way we travel once the northern runway reopens?
Not really. Most of the changes have been technical. We've put in a new instrument landing system. We've replaced the tarmac. We've replaced all the runway lighting. So it's much more about maintenance and refurbishment than anything that passengers will notice. Maybe the touchdown of aircraft might be a little bit more smooth on the newly refurbished tarmac, but I doubt there'll be anything in particular that passengers will notice.
All right, I'm going to be keeping an eye out for that next touchdown at Terminal 3 on Emirates. I did notice about 1,000 flights per week. They are being affected. I know they're being rerouted through Dubai World Central. Now, it's interesting. It tends to be the low-cost carriers that have had their flights rerouted. Was that a conscious decision to keep the high payers happy?
Well, actually, we've been fairly even in our distribution of the move of traffic, but I think the low-cost carriers have less dependence on the hub at DXB. Therefore, the connectivity at DXB is less part of their product. So it's rather easier for them to move. But Fly Dubai has actually taken a large amount of their operations to DWC. And I think overall, the distribution of traffic between the two airports went very smoothly. There were some quite intense negotiations lasting several months to decide who was going to go and who was going to stay. But it's settled down in the end. I think most carriers got what they want within the constraints that we were able to offer them, and the operation seems to be going very well so far.
Did Emirates have any of their flights moved to Dubai World Central?
They have moved some, okay. Yes, their cargo
what percentage?
operation.
But cargo's been there for a while, hasn't it? What about the passenger flights?
Passenger flights, no, not so many. They've actually remained mostly at DXB. Emirates have actually coped with the reduction by reducing the number of services.
Okay, now I noticed another change recently at Terminal 3 arrivals. Jumeirah has recently introduced a presidential style suite so that VIPs there, they can relax in a fancy suite while their luggage is sent onto the hotel. Is this part of a big move to turn the experience at the airport into more of a hospitality focused experience rather than just infrastructure? And are we going to be seeing any more joint ventures with Jumeirah or other big names?
That's absolutely the case. We've decided that actually our customers through the pandemic needed a little bit more looking after than perhaps they would in normal times. And we took that as an opportunity to actually reinvent our business model. Obviously, our infrastructure is a major part of an operation of an airport, but actually it's the customers going through that we have to keep happy. They're paying all our wages, and it's their satisfaction that is upmost in our mind. So we are looking at enhancing a lot of our hospitality offers. You've mentioned the Jumeirah Presidential Lounge, which is a wonderful facility. We've actually refurbished and completely reimagined what we call our Majlis service, which you can book online, and any customer can be met at the aircraft by a chauffeur-driven, dedicated limousine and driven to this VIP facility. And we do encourage people to have a look online at that facility. It's really quite special.
Certainly good with kids as well. I mean, in terms of the VIP experiences, you've obviously got them checked off. But what about for the more everyday consumers as well? Maybe their purse strings are a little bit tighter.
Yes, but I think the thing is, whichever category of passenger we're serving at the airport, we try and make the experience as special as we possibly can. We're refurbishing at all of the time, all of our concessionaires. We're updating our food and beverage and restaurant offer. Our bars are always changing, the retail's changing. We've just opened some major brand stores within the airport, joint ventures with a lot of the famous worldwide brands. So the airport's constantly moving, constantly adapting its product. We've got some great local companies as well, putting great innovative brands into the airport, new coffee shops and new restaurants and things. So it's a city that never sleeps, the airport. We're always reimagining it, and we're following very closely our consumer trends, our consumer feedback, to make sure we're always making DXB the most desirable place to visit, to shop and to fly from.
It's been a similar experience at our malls, isn't it? Making them more of a lifestyle destination as well. It's interesting to now see that come into the aviation market. Well, moving sideways a little bit, another big topic as well is always security when it comes to aviation. Now, obviously the recent Houthi drone attacks on Abu Dhabi airport, that was a big shock to the region. Has that changed the way you think about investments in security for Dubai airport, and what kind of new measures are you putting in place to make sure that passengers can be safe?
Well, safety and security, as you can imagine, when you're running the world's largest airport, is always top of the agenda. We take many, many measures and are continually updating those measures to make sure that our customers and staff are as safe as they possibly can be. Obviously, we have taken measures, which I won't talk about for obvious reasons, to make sure that we are completely secure against any threats that might be out there. But it's interesting actually how the changing nature of those threats requires us to be on our toes. Cyber security is a massive problem at the moment, and the number of potentially malicious attacks is increasing almost by the day. But we're on top of that.
What percentage are you seeing it increase by?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at the number of emails, for example, that are malicious, and the traffic that actually is nothing to do with business, it's up at the 70%. So it's a huge amount of the total traffic that is actually not emails that are solicited or anything to do with running the airport. But we're on top of that. We've got the latest technology to deal with that, and some very highly trained staff as well.
So would you say you're seeing more of an emphasis on cybersecurity and cyber attacks, that is a greater threat than some of the physical attacks like we saw with the drones from the Houthis this year?
I think we can never be complacent. There are people out there that obviously are seeking to disrupt our operation, and they can originate from all sorts of different places in all sorts of forms. We just have to be vigilant, and we're constantly investing in training and technology to actually counter the changing threat.
Mm-hmm. Watch this space. It's been a couple of months now since flights between Dubai and Israel resumed. There had been a dispute, reportedly a security dispute. The details were never properly revealed. However, it's thought to be surrounding the fact that they wanted to have some Israeli forces here on the ground at Dubai airport. I know you commented on the issue at the time. Has it now been resolved, and how did that play out? How was it resolved?
It's been fully resolved. The security services met, and after a great deal of discussion, we came up with a resolution. The Israeli carriers are currently operating from DWC during the Northern Runway refurbishment works, but they will be relocating back to DXB as soon as they are over. So we believe we're in a good place, and I think the traffic between the two cities has been very strong.
What were some of the reasons for the dispute? I know at the time you told Reuters you hoped the dispute would be sorted very quickly. There were obviously high-level discussions going on, but there were very real threats to actually stop flights, weren't there?
There was some discussion about whether the services could continue, but thankfully that was resolved very amicably by the appropriate security forces in dialogue with each other.
And any concerns moving forward?
No, none whatsoever.
Okay, so clear skies so far. Well, talked about security. Let's talk a little bit about sustainability. It's obviously no secret the aviation industry is one of the world's greatest contributors to carbon emissions. Now, you put some fascinating green initiatives into place at Dubai airports, everything from banning single-use plastics for a couple of years. You've got solar panels over on Terminal 2, and you've converted your ground vehicles to green or hybrid vehicles as well. Are these initiatives making an impact? What kind of changes have you seen?
They are certainly making an impact. I mean, we can't ignore that obviously between 2 and 3% of the world's carbon emissions originate from aviation. And obviously we have to take our fuel with us when an aircraft departs the ground, and that's a pretty hard thing to mitigate. However, we are concentrating on hopefully the low-hanging fruit of decarbonising all of the ground operations. So as you've mentioned, we've put solar panels on huge amounts of our roof spaces. We've just recently removed all the shading on one of our car parks, and we're going to be installing solar panels which will have the dual impact of keeping cars cool as well as generating power for the airport. So huge number of initiatives, you've mentioned a lot of them. The decarbonisation of all our ground transportation is the next step. But I think it's one of those subjects that is, if we don't get it right, it's going to be a major hurdle for the future. Consumers will not be wanting to patronise any airport or airline that's not taking sustainability extremely seriously, and we're looking at practical measures of extending the reduction of our carbon footprint steadily over the years to come.
What kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of electricity saved or percentage of carbon emissions each year? Give me some facts that we can get our teeth into a bit.
Well, we obviously have a significant electricity load. I think we're one of the single largest consumers on the DIWA grid here. We've had to reduce that by a significant amount. We've replaced tens of thousands of light bulbs throughout the airport. We've now gone to an active management system of all our air conditioning because, of course, particularly in the summer months, that's our biggest electrical load. We've got fan controls. We're talking about optimization of all our chilling plants. So there's a huge amount to go at, and it's not going to be one single tick in the box with one initiative. It's going to be thousands of significant initiatives to control our consumption of electricity in particular, reduce our water consumption, lots of things like that. It's not going to be solved overnight. It won't be solved by one single initiative, but all of our staff are being encouraged to think of small ways to contribute towards the decarbonisation of the entire airport operation.
Yeah, make a big impact there. I know some countries around the world, some airports are actually introducing air traffic control operations, introducing new technology to help them plan more sustainable, more efficient routes. Is that something that Dubai Airports is looking at doing or is currently doing?
We use our runways particularly efficiently at DXB. That's how we're able to get such a high throughput with a relatively modest ground area. I think the thing is the cooperation with air traffic control worldwide needs to improve before we can see much more efficient use of the airspace to cut down emissions, etc. I know some tests have been run. The other area of great excitement is the potential for developing sustainable aviation fuel. That's something that we're looking at very seriously with various partners around the world. We're in consultation with other airports about how that might work. Problem at the moment is the supply and distribution of it is a challenge. It's quite expensive to produce, although there's enough feedstock to allow all of the aviation enterprises around the world to run their operations on sustainable aviation fuel. The production of it and the distribution of it remains actually quite in its infancy. So there needs to be a lot of investment and development and a lot of cooperation there.
I know IATA says sustainable aviation fuels, they can cut emissions by about 80%. And I think you're doing trials with Emirates in the third quarter of this year. I believe they currently said they're in talks with you about how to actually make sure the fuel is properly sent to the airport, stored on site as well. What's the status of those discussions?
Well, it's interesting. One of the challenges, if you produce sustainable aviation fuel, you've got to have a combination of factors. You've got to have the feedstock, which comes from a lot of water and some plants which absorb carbon as they grow. And the idea is then you manufacture the fuel from those with the embedded carbon, and then when it's released into the atmosphere, you end up back to net zero. So it does actually produce a much more efficient and environmentally friendly outcome. Difficulty, of course, is you have to transport it anywhere. You're eradicating a lot of the advantages. So what we're thinking about now, say, for example, on the west coast of America, there is the capability to produce significant volumes of sustainable aviation fuel. It's best to inject it into the supply system at the closest local point. And so long as it's going into the fuel supply system and displacing Jet A1 as the primary fuel, then obviously the environmental benefit is greatly improved. So I think it's perhaps not necessary to suggest that you inject it right at your home base, but as long as you're participating in a global system and it is being used around the world, then you are achieving the same objective.
That's interesting. So you're saying for the real take-up of sustainable aviation fuels, price is obviously one press point, but really we need this global cooperation. We need an international network of the availability before it can be a success. It's not good enough for Dubai carriers saying they'll do it. They need it in all the different parts of the world. Do you think that's going to be a real holdback then, particularly for some countries who potentially don't have the ability for the feedstock, for the transportation, and to have that availability at the airports?
I think what's happening now is we have to concentrate on what is the best local way to decarbonise. And obviously here we have an abundance of solar energy. So decarbonising the actual electricity supply, as we've seen from some of the solar plants that have been created here, is the easiest way for the UAE to go. Growing feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel is obviously more of a challenge. But as I mentioned before, there are parts of the world, South America, North America, where that's going to be possible. And I think so long as we participate in that global network, we can do two things. First of all, make sure that sustainable aviation fuel displaces as much Jet A1 closest to the source of manufacture as is possible. And secondly, also to make sure that there is some form of subsidy in place, so we are able to absorb the cost of producing sustainable aviation fuel across the entire jet fuel supply chain. So no individual carrier will feel the pain of having to be environmentally friendly more than any other. We all share the cost and we all reap the reward.
And where should that subsidy come from? Should it come from government? Should it come from higher ticket fares for the consumers?
Well, I think ultimately, at the end of the day, in order for aviation to be sustainable, that will involve a cost increase. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something perhaps for governments to get their heads around. I rather think that governments maybe should insist on a gradated quota system where airlines and airports over time need to meet a certain percentage of sustainable aviation fuel. But I think that's best left to the individual geographies of how sustainable aviation fuel is going to be possible to inject into the local supply chain. I rather think that spreading the cost across the existing jet fuel supply, so you perhaps only have to add a few cents to a gallon of jet fuel to be able to pay for the additional cost of producing sustainable aviation fuel, that's probably going to be the way that we actually cover the increase in cost.
Okay.
That may have to be passed on in small increases in ticket prices, but sustainability has got to happen and we've got to pay for it somehow.
That's very true, but it's whether consumers want to take that step. Even with a lot of airlines, you can now pay a little bit extra to offset it. And I think, it works in some parts, and in other parts of the world, people say no. We all like to be a bit cheap, don't we? So we'll see. Some other big developments in the industry. Qantas, the Australian carrier, they have a big partnership with Emirates. They've recently announced they're that much closer to introducing ultra long haul flights. 2025, I think, is the timeline for London to Sydney non-stop, New York to Melbourne as well. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think these ultra long haul flights, are they the future of travel? And what does it mean for Dubai, who is a hub?
Well, I think it's a great technical development. The only difficulty, of course, is that it's not going to be cheap. Because let's face it, for every 10 tons of jet fuel you carry, you have to carry about another 2 tons to be able to, actually carry that initial 10 tons as well. So the fuel consumption over longer distances is obviously going to be greater. And that's, I think, in the experience so far, where obviously ticket prices on those ultra long haul services have to be higher. So I think, the world will have a choice. You can pay a premium and go non-stop over that period, or you can go via a hub and pay perhaps a lower price. So I think those for whom time is a key component of their travel, they may want to pay the premium. And I think it's down to individual choice. Some people will be happy to spend 20 hours on an aeroplane. Some others want to stop and stretch their legs. So long as the consumer choice is there, I think that's very good. I don't think it's going to have an impact on hubs at all. Mm-hmm. Hubs are here to stay. The threat, so perceived, of direct services is actually not a threat, because the number of direct services that can be sustained on an ultra long haul basis is probably not that great. So I don't see any impact on the existing hubs for connectivity, because they're providing thousands of city pairs And obviously that's of huge benefit to the vast majority of travellers.
So no impact on Dubai. What about you? Would you take one of these ultra long haul flights?
I think I would. I'm such an aviation geek. Anything that's new in aviation, I'd love to be on board, yes.
Well, speaking of things new in aviation, we've seen NEOM come out and announce they're about to begin the world's first commercially available flights from NEOM. They've decided to start with Dubai and then London shortly after. How important do you think it is, the fact that they've chosen Dubai as their first stop? What does it mean for the city? And are there any potential room for other collaborations between the UAE and Saudi Arabia in terms of aviation?
Well, it's interesting. I think a lot of people will be expecting me to say, well, Saudi is going to be a competitor, but actually the Saudi market's incredibly important for Dubai. It's our third largest market, and very, very important that we actually establish more and more air routes. It's been hugely expanded over the last few years, and actually I think Saudi developing its tourism industry is actually good for Dubai. If you look at more established travel regions such as Europe and the US, people rarely go just to one city and then go home again. And actually having more travel options and more cities to visit in the Middle East, which includes cities in Saudi Arabia, will be very beneficial for all of the GCC countries, because people will be able to come to Dubai, then go to Saudi, go to Oman, go to other cities in the region, and do what lots of people do around Europe. You know, you rarely go to London, you want to go to Paris, you want to go to Madrid, you want to go to Rome. So I think it's going to be very good for the region to have an increased number of tourism options.
A bit like the increased traffic we saw from Dubai's Expo or the upcoming expectations for Qatar's World Cup as well. Final question today. What's your outlook for the market moving forwards? It sounds like Dubai is looking stronger than ever. Where do you feel we're moving? We mentioned earlier the lockdowns in China. There's still parts of the world that are slowly reopening. It's still some time till we're going to get back to pre-pandemic levels. But ultimately, you feel quite positive, I would say.
I do feel positive. The actual recovery that we've seen over the last few months, I think, has re-emphasised that. We've had to revise our projections for the year 3 times so far. We're close to about 55 million projected for the year. And as you mentioned right at the top of the hour, we talked about the idea of pre-pandemic levels being established up to about 10 months or even a year earlier than we originally projected during 2024. So I think overall, notwithstanding the potential turbulence of the economy and political events and recovery from COVID-19, I'm very bullish about the future, and I'm very bullish about the aerospace sector in Dubai. I think it's a great place to be. It's got a lot of attraction to the world, and I think we're going to continue to be the world's #1, the biggest and the best for many, many years to come.
And time for that IPO, I'd say. Paul Griffiths, CEO of Dubai Airports, thank you so much for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.